find out when you're on the street, when evening falls so hard, I will comfort you. I'll take your part when darkness comes and pain is all around, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me Sail on, silver girl, sail on by. Your time has come to shine. All your dreams are on their way. See how they shine. Oh, if you need a friend, I'm sailing right behind, like a bridge over troubled water. I will ease your mind like a bridge over troubled water. I will ease your
Steve stood outside a single-family home in the Mekong Delta, his fist raised, ready to knock on the door. And he knew that what happened next could change his life. You see, Steve had flown over 8,000 miles from the United States to arrive at the doorstep of the Lam That family. This was now almost 20 years after the Vietnam War ended, and for the better part of those 20 years, Steve could not sleep but a few hours a night. His dreams haunted by nightmares. He used drugs and alcohol to try and push away the demons that surrounded him. At one point, he wanted to die, but something inside of him also wanted to live. and he wanted to do something to confront this part of his past. And so that journey brought him to the doorstep of the Lam That family and to the home of Ut, a Vietnamese guide for American tourists. On the other side of that door were Ut's parents, who had fought in and survived the Vietnam War, though not unscathed. On the other side of that door, there was a war that had not ended when Saigon fell. On the other side of that door are two stories that I want to share with you this morning, drawn from recent and past experiences that brought me to today's reflection. But first, perhaps you're wondering, why have I chosen this Sunday to take up this theme and to tell you these stories? Many of my colleagues are doing Star Wars-based services today. Yeah, beginning their sermons with, "May the 4th be with you." And I know I'm mixing sci-fi metaphors here, but those of you who remember Star Trek know that. So I was tempted to do that myself today, a lighthearted reflection to send you off into what I had hoped would be a bright and sunny May morning. But I'm saving that Star Wars reflection for another Sunday because my mind and heart have gone in a different direction today. There are two anniversaries that I've been mindful of this week. April 30th was the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon and the end of the American side of the war in Vietnam. And today is May 4th, and it's the 55th anniversary of the killing of 4 students and wounding of 9 others on the campus of my alma mater, Kent State University. Some of those students were protesting that same war that day. And there's a third reason why I've been thinking about these two dates, because before I arrived to be your interim bridge minister, I'd spent 2.5 weeks in Vietnam and Cambodia this past December. I became interested in these two countries not because I had a personal connection with the Vietnam War, but because of the many stories I've heard from spending time, confessional here, in nail salons, usually run by Vietnamese families, many of whom fled Vietnam during or shortly after the fall of Saigon. And over the course of years, I have heard so many stories, harrowing stories, of leaving their homeland, as well as the stories that I heard about the United States from Vietnamese people who lived through that time when I was in Vietnam and Cambodia. And those stories were powerful and compelling. So I wanted to see for myself what was on the other side of this conflict in the lives and stories of real people. We are living in a time when powerful leaders at home and abroad are exercising their power with chaotic disregard for diplomacy, conflict de-escalation, and the soft power of building relationships for mutual good, putting this country and, I would say, the world in peril. But as we know, war is not just something that happens over there in a faraway land. There are also battles which we wage inside of the human heart, torn between standing with our morals and compromising them. And the battles we wage with one another when we can't agree on which set of values we should share. Now, war supposedly has a start date and an end date, but when peace comes, the peace that means only the end of direct military violence, well, that's when the other side of war begins. And that other side of war, of course, involves physical recovery, the construction of new infrastructure, of cities and towns, and the building of housing, and the recovery of an economy. But there is a spiritual recovery on the other side of war as well, not just in support of the emotional and spiritual needs of the people who have suffered losses, but also a long-term recovery from the moral injury that is left when a war is supposedly over. And that is something in all of this rhetoric about war we don't often talk about. In recent years, important work has been done by both psychologists and theologians on what we now understand as invisible moral injuries, suffered because of conflict and war. It is not PTSD, although PTSD can contribute to moral injury. But the definition of moral injury is the psychological, social, and spiritual impact of events involving betrayal or transgression of one's deeply held moral beliefs. And in the case of our veterans, those that occur during high-stakes situations, usually of life or death. And in the case of those who have served in wartime, moral injury involves lasting emotional, psychological, social, behavioral impacts of actions that violate a service member's core behavioral expectations of self or others. So, a soldier like Steve is sent to Vietnam believing that his military service serves a just cause, and in preparing for war tries to square that with the morality he learned in his Christian Sunday school in Dayton, Ohio. To love one's neighbor as oneself, to turn the other cheek, to forgive one's enemies. Steve went to Vietnam, not sure about how much combat he would see. When Steve's boat of soldiers was attacked by Viet Cong guerrillas from the riverbank, where people from the village were washing clothes and refreshing their bodies, he panicked. He opened fire, wildly and randomly, shooting at whatever he saw on the banks of the river. He had no idea if he had killed the men who were shooting at him, but he felt pretty sure afterwards that he had killed some civilians, perhaps women and children, who were simply doing laundry in the river. And as his boat sped away and his fellow soldiers congratulated themselves on surviving, Steve began to experience the suffering of what would be the first of many moral injuries in his life. He was haunted by the fear that he had killed innocent people under the sanction of war. Now, I heard Steve's story from our Vietnamese guide, Oot. And Oot told us that Steve decided 20 years after he left Vietnam that the only way he could find some inner healing would be to return to the land where the killing took place. And even more than that, he wanted to meet people who were Viet Cong. So he hired Oot as a guide and a translator to shepherd him through the hardest moments of his life. And Oot knew what he had to do. Oot said that he invited Steve to meet his own parents, who were part of a family who had 4 generations of warfare in their history, each generation fighting a foreign invader: Chinese, Cambodian, French, and American. And Oot asked his parents if he could invite Steve for dinner. And that is what led him to the doorstep of Oot's house. And that door opened, and Steve was greeted first by the smell of pho, that noodle soup that takes all day to prepare and to cook properly, and then by the smiles from a Vietnamese couple who seemed so small compared to Steve's size, a couple now in their 70s, welcoming him into their home. Oot told us that Steve and his parents talked long into the night, and his parents told Steve about what it was like to be surrounded by American servicemen, some who were kind and others who were violent and abusive. And Steve told Oot's parents about how he was afraid all the time and that his tour of duty had turned him into someone he no longer knew and never wanted to become. Oot, our guide, said that when Steve left his parents' home that night, his demeanor had changed. Steve and Oot stayed in touch for many years afterwards, and Steve got sober, he married, had a child, and Steve died from cancer about 10 years ago now. But Oot said that he attributed that meeting with Oot's parents as a transformative moment that changed his life. And something inside of him had begun to heal. So, why do I tell you these stories, or this story of something that happened long ago and far away? Because the fear that bred and fed the violence that occurs in war and that occurred on May 4th, 1970, came home to the United States on a Midwestern college campus. In fact, Kent State prior to May 4th was called Apathy U because the students were not involved in protests. I was not yet of college age on that day, but my own experience of its aftermath has convinced me that the trauma of moral injury can be experienced not just by individuals directly involved in the violence of war, but by communities like Kent, by states like Ohio, and by an entire nation. Shots were fired among our own people, not against foreigners demonized as enemies. And when I go back to Kent and walk that campus, I'm reminded that the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It lives with us and within us. So I've been thinking about that phrase, moral injury, and it is most often associated with war veterans, but there is also a recognition that moral injuries can occur in less grievous, less serious circumstances, and that's described as moral distress. And I believe that's what many of us perhaps are experiencing right now in these times, is a form of moral distress. And a few of the symptoms of moral distress are things like a sense that one can never do enough, or hypervigilance, or chronic exhaustion, or inability to listen, or fear, or anger, or feeling hopeless and helpless. Do you know what I'm talking about right now? Have you been feeling it too? Because the values I believe in, the values we believe in, the values that framed the foundation of this faith are being systematically attacked by a slew of executive orders. So if we believe in justice, then we see injustice when Americans who are here legally can be arrested and threatened with deportation for exercising their right to protest. And if we believe in equity, then we cannot ignore the fact that political conservatives have attempted to literally whitewash the reality of racism and the horrors that America has inflicted on people of color and indigenous peoples. And if we believe that pluralism and diversity is a strength, is a value, then we cannot turn a blind eye to the attempts to eradicate all diversity in sectors of public life. This is not just intellectual or political differences of opinion. These are moral stresses and distresses on the body politic, that is, the larger body of a country to which we belong and to which many of us believe in. So the war that's being waged right now in the United States is a war of words between those who believe the current administration's directives are a necessary correction to make America great again, and those, and I put myself in this camp, who are increasingly terrified about the rise of nationalism, fascism, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia, transphobia. The list could go on. So what could be on the other side of that war? I have an answer, but it comes through the sharing of another story. In 2011, my husband and I were granted a 3-month sabbatical where we would spend a month in each of 3 countries, Spain, Israel, and Turkey. And our sabbatical focus was inspired by the story of Andalusia, the peninsula in southern Spain, where for 7 centuries, Jews, Muslims, Christians lived together in an atmosphere of tolerance, where literature and science and arts flourished. So we visited Spain, but after visiting Spain, our next stop was Israel and Palestine. With support from Witness for Peace and the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, Ohio, we connected with an organization called the Parent Circle Families Forum, a grassroots organization of Palestinian and Israeli families who have lost immediate family members due to the conflict. It was founded by Yitzhak Frankenthal, whose 19-year-old son, Arik Frankenthal, was kidnapped and killed by Hamas. And he was joined by Palestinian mothers and fathers and siblings who had similarly lost loved ones in the ongoing violence. And they invited our group to witness their conversation of shared losses, as well as the ways in which they were healing from those losses. And there they sat, sharing the most excruciating experience anyone can suffer, the loss of a child. And at the end of their sharing and their conversation, they turned to our group to see if we had any questions for them. "How can you do this?" asked one woman. "How can you just sit in the same room with each other?" One Palestinian father said that the first step towards reconciliation is to recognize the suffering of the other. And another spokesperson for the Parent Circle put it this way: if you are pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, you are not helping us. You are just feeling good about yourself. What was on the other side of war? Loss, certainly. But what I experienced was something else. It was hope. Not born on rhetoric, but on the one-and-one experience of talking with each other. So when I arrived here in January, one of the requests I heard from some members of this congregation was that they wanted to talk with each other about the war that's currently still happening between Israel and Hamas. And in subsequent prayers, I acknowledged the terror and trauma of October 7th attack by Hamas, whose brutality was beyond comprehension. And I mourned the loss of life with the hostages who are still in captivity, with the irrefutable evidence of the rise of anti-Semitism at home and abroad. And I also recognized the revulsion and horror of the war that is being waged at the expense of the civilian population in Gaza, whose livelihood and lives are destroyed, whose food supplies have now been cut off, who live in fear that on the other side of this war will mean the expulsion from the land that they have lived on for many generations. Both of these needs and realities exist in, among, and beyond us. So as I say these words, can you feel what's rising inside of you right now? Can you feel the pull towards one side or another? Can you hear the arguments in your mind framing the email that you will send to me after this sermon to tell me what I should have said or not said? I feel all those things too. These are some of the symptoms of the moral distress we are experiencing as we try to find our own place to stand within the long history and complex politics behind the violence that we have seen in Israel since October 7th. Moral injury is a psychological and spiritual condition that does not respect borders or distances because our spiritual lives are inextricably connected to our values. So I understand it may seem naive to believe that we can do something to heal the escalating violence in the world by just sitting down with each other and telling each other our stories. Or is it? There is another side of war, that we can heal from moral injury and moral distress by meeting with each other, by finding ways to truly listen to each other and to see, and I think this is the most important thing, to see and feel the suffering of the other. It's hard work. It takes time. And sometimes conflict has escalated to a place where other nonviolent approaches may be necessary. Yet this congregation can serve as a laboratory for figuring out the things that make for peace. Maybe not before my time with you ends, but perhaps you will hear this sermon as an invitation to undertake the healing of moral injury and moral distress, and in doing so, help others learn how to be peacemakers as well. So I want to conclude by going back to the words of Szymborska, the poem that begins with, "After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all." And she continues to describe the rubble caused by war, but ends on a hopeful note. She says, "In the grass that has overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in mouth, gazing at the clouds." Or, as the Sufi poet and mystic reminds us, out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. May it be so.